Hey guys, I'm Darja and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at a startup called Bunch. And we are on a mission to help quantify the effect of the human element in organizations on its performance. So we're quantifying culture and linking it to business outcomes. I'm super excited to be here today and to share a little bit about the learnings we've made with our customers and our users on how to create an effective and high performing culture when you build your business and when you build your team. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through different aspects, ranging from, on the one hand, what is company culture and what do we actually which aspects do we actually refer to when we talk about it, since it's a very widely used term, of course. But also we'll dive a little bit into the actual data-driven element of it. So how can you use data measurement to make culture tangible and also manageable? And then we'll head into a section of the webinar where we will cover what can this mean for you, how can you use it for your company and your team to make sure that as you grow and as you scale and build your business, your team's culture scales with it. And in the end, I'm super excited to, of course, also answer all questions around the content, but also any other experiences that you guys had and that you would want to reflect, or questions that range or that origin in your experiences that you have around culture. So really excited about hearing your feedback, comments, thoughts, and address any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to what we're doing. As you probably already figured out, of course, starting to build your business, most of us are very aware of the power of the team, and it's all about people, specifically when you actually build businesses that are intense in technology and employ a lot of knowledge workers. The magic trick seems to be not only to actually attract great people and help them to provide value and create impact in your company, but it's actually quite tricky to figure out how to make the team work. There's a lot of, I think, anecdotal knowledge and also scientific evidence on it's not really about maximizing the individual. So it's not so important to actually find 10 A players and group them together. But if designed carefully and built carefully, teams can supersede the actual sum of individual contributions. So through synergies and careful crafting of the dynamics in the team, you can actually achieve much, much better results and higher performance levels with a great team than you can with just summing up the individual contributions. And the reason why culture in the latest age has become so popular is that culture seems to be the lever that actually has impact on almost everything in a company, in a business, and an organization. So it literally is the lever that helps you to simultaneously impact the effectiveness of the whole team. So it impacts individuals by creating specific employee experiences and experience of working together, but it also impacts the dynamics in a team. So culture is that offers this great opportunity to actually influence much, much more than you can, for instance, by just changing incentive structures, etc. There's obviously a lot of literature written on the topic, and I think on the scientific side, but also specifically in the practitioners field. So entrepreneurs, founders, leaders in the field are very much engaged with the topic and really have provided very interesting perspectives, one of which we share here. I think Airbnb and the founders definitely came out in the technology field as the company that actually really cares about culture. Brian Chesky has written a lot of literature. There's a lot of Medium articles that are actually worth reading from him. And he said that culture in the end is 1,000 things done 1,000 times. So it's not so much about the core values that you end up formulating with your team and passing around. It's not so much about putting them on walls and so on. It's all of it. So the way you act, the way you interact with each other, the way you write emails, the way you interact with your customers, when you are working together, all the sum of the little decisions you make on a daily basis in the end actually sum up to making your kind of creating a cultural footprint. So if you manage to create an effective culture, it becomes a superpower, because basically it enables everyone to pull in the right direction, in the same direction together when you're not there. So it's the ultimate kind of opportunity to actually influence everything in a team and everything in a company without being physically present. And so, of course, companies that actually do that really well see a lot of like positive outcomes. However, this is not the only reason why thinking, strategizing, and actually acting upon culture and designing cultures in companies is important. There's an opportunity cost of neglecting it. And so I think it's specifically relevant for companies that just start out. Because I think when you are just in the beginning of scaling and building your business, it's always very, very fuzzy and kind of seems hard to grasp, and can end up as the topic that you know and care about and you know it's important, but end up deprioritizing on a daily basis just because it's relatively hard to see urgency in it. It's the aspect of your business that basically requires very careful prioritization and like meaningful prioritization from your end. If neglect happens, or if founders don't care about that aspect of their business, what it typically leads to is literally derailing not only the cultural aspect of the business, but actually ultimately derailing performance and a lot of other aspects of the business, derailing strategy, and literally costs you the results and outcomes and the success that you are planning to achieve. So it's that element of culture that makes it relatively hard, because on the one hand, we all understand it's really important, or at least most of us do. On the other hand, it's hard to grasp, it's relatively intangible, or at least it seems. And if we do neglect it because we are having struggles to actually really catch it and kind of make it manageable, we will ultimately see negative results in our business because of that. And so this is all good, typically, and anecdotal, of course, and it always seems, hypothetical. But when we look at the numbers, actually, so the numbers that are related to cultural outcomes, it's really interesting to see that there is a clear link between performance and culture. So I want to reference three aspects or three numbers that clearly show a link between companies investing in culture producing better outcomes. On the one hand, or on the left side, you see that 5x number. Basically, scientists or researchers that we've teamed up with from Stanford, who actually are responsible for a large amount of research around quantifying culture, specifically Charles O'Reilly, but also his colleagues, Jennifer Chapman and co, have made really, really good progress on not only making culture measurable, but also tying it back to the outcomes that companies are producing. So they've looked, and they've specifically worked with technology companies, mostly enterprise. So in their research, they have included companies like Dell, Google, Intel, Apple. And what they basically found when they went into the teams and in divisions and actually assessed or measured the team's cultures, and have correlated that with the financial outcome. I think in this particular paper that is cited here, they looked at EBITDAs, EBITDAs on, I think, a quarterly annual basis. They saw that companies and divisions that actually have a more consistent cultural core, so a more coherent, strong cultural core. We'll see in a couple of minutes what that exactly means, strong. But teams that actually show stronger cultural cores produce 5 times more revenues and profits on average in comparison to those that have diffuse cultures. So when there is no clear DNA stamp or structure around how a team and division operates, it's much, much harder to create the outcomes in comparison to when you actually craft the cultural core. So it's definitely worth doing it. On the other hand, and I think this is a very interesting number as well, which is very, very recent, and probably a lot of you can relate to it. When you actually look for talent in your recruiting, the current market is really, really candidate friendly. What that means is the best candidates can pick between up to 15 different opportunities at a time and find the next job in under 2 weeks. That also means if you actually want to hire strong talent, you really need to cater to much more and much more complicated needs than just having a good package, because everyone by now has a good package. So candidates really, really care about the intangibles of a business. They really care about the culture. They expect the businesses to produce much more than an actual business outcome or monetary outcome. They expect a clear purpose, they expect consistency in the culture in relation to that purpose, and a very stringent story between the inside and the outside of the business. So what I'm trying to get at, if you actually invest in crafting this story and iterating towards a culture that really, really makes sense for your business, you will see increase in inbound applicants that really, really matter for your business. So the quality of applications will go up if you can have a coherent story and really tell it clearly to the outside world, which I think is really important in the current market, specifically when you're building a business that is new and has a new employer brand, and definitely faces the challenge of competing with established employer brands, like we know in the market, Google, Facebooks, and Netflixes. And the third one is kind of more a foresight metric, but still very, very important. Once you actually have been able to attract the right talent that you need, and you've worked out how to clearly communicate the message of what your culture is about, what do you care about, what are your what's your cultural core, what are the beliefs that you actually operate on. It's really, really key to work out on this, like the behavioral mechanisms that you can employ in order for these beliefs not only be claims in a PowerPoint or claims on your website. So it's on the one hand about, of course, telling a clear story, but when it comes to retaining those employees, it's really, really important to have infrastructure, behavioral infrastructure, so habits, rituals, processes that basically support your belief system. And so we're going to talk about how that can be accomplished and achieved. So knowing all of this, and knowing that this is an interesting topic and we all like to read and talk about it, and this is probably also the reason why you are in this webinar and interested in the topic here today, it would be good to actually shed light on what is this really, because everyone understands, I think, a different thing when we talk about company culture, and there's definitely different levels of definition. So looking at Harvard Business Review and what they think about culture, I think what you find is oftentimes articles around how the culture is not a mandate. So despite of the fact that you as a company and you as a founder seem to have the job to actually design this cultural core and make sure it actually comes to life in your company, there is also this other opposite opinion or position that you can't actually just dictate it top down. It needs to be somehow developed bottom up while still being infused and kind of strategized around from the top management team. So you can influence it and you can iterate on it and you can form and shape it, but you can't just claim this is the culture we need to have and basically kind of expect it to be there, which again argues for an investment and actually having mechanics around how to develop the culture you need. I've borrowed from the Netflix culture deck here, which you're probably familiar with. If you're not, it's really worth checking out. You can find it on SlideShare. And it's fairly famous document, I think, has served as inspiration for a lot of founders. And what they basically kind of like summarize in terms of aspects of culture is starting with the values, which I think is a lot of times what people kind of refer to when we talk about culture. Oftentimes it's values that come into play and into the conversation very quickly, but it's much, much more than that, which is why I want to point that out. And I think Netflix does this really nicely. They have defined what in their context actually are the pillars that carry the culture forward. So Yes, for values and beliefs, but it's also about high performance. The culture of Netflix is very, very performance-oriented culture. So they're more of an athletic organization than anything else, and it is one of the pillars of their organization, of their culture. But there's also freedom and responsibility, context, not control. Um, they talk about alignment, so it's not about actually having a very, very kind of like top-down dictation mode of this is what we want to be, this is what we are, but it's really the seeking and aligning over and over again. I think they're actually emphasizing very nicely. And there is also the logistical element to it. So it's not only important to actually see and kind of like consistently define what beliefs your culture is based on in the company. It's also very important to actually realize it in behaviors, but also in company strategy. So when you actually design incentive structures, when you design levels of promotions and mechanics of promotions, when you design your employee stock option pools and so on, it won't work. It won't be as effective to just have a cultural discussion isolated from any of these things. So basically, because culture is everything you do, all the mini decisions on a daily basis, it literally needs to be translated in almost every aspect of the business. So it sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but there is definitely some quick hacks. And last but not least, I think getting closer to the question of what is culture really, um, Netflix, I think, finds really good words for it. It's literally the behaviors and skills, so the things that people do and show that are valued by others in your team and in your company, that in the end makes your culture. So if you as a founder think that you have a transparent culture, or you have a collaborative culture, or any of the other things that are important to you, that might be your perspective on your culture. What your culture really is, however, is what others around you value in others. So obviously you can influence that by communication, by framing it, by also incentivizing and punishing specific behaviors and specific communication. However, in the end, whatever you do still only first needs to land in the heads and in the hearts of your people before it can become culture. So your vision and your idea of culture is not the same thing as your actual factual culture. So just as with any other part of your business where you actually create a vision or financial plan, the trick is really, on the one hand, of course, to craft a clear picture of where you want to go, but then also to iterate and to continuously put effort to get there. So it's just the same with culture as with any other aspect of your business in that sense. I've also pulled up one of our collaboration partners. So this is Charles O'Reilly, who I've mentioned earlier, and has done a lot of really, really great work in understanding how corporate culture actually links to performance. Because I think a lot of people in leadership positions, a lot of founders, a lot of people in entrepreneurship and thought leaders have this kind of subconscious or more conscious assumption culture is somehow important, and somehow we all understand it really matters, but we still have difficulties to actually nailing it and understanding what it really is and how it operates and how can we use it and how does that impact what we're producing on a daily basis with our teams. So Charles O'Reilly dedicated a large part of his academic life to actually finding this link, and he's found this repeatedly in his studies. And we'll be covering how this looks like just in a few seconds. So he says company culture, and again, there's multiple definitions, but I really, really like his because it goes to the core of what I think we're after in this session. Company culture is a social control system that drives certain kinds of behaviors. And it might sound a bit rough, and it's maybe not the romantic definition that you would expect. And it might not be as inspiring or philosophical. However, it really, really gets to the mechanic core of how culture operates. Basically, if you want your team to walk in a specific direction, to execute in a specific direction, you have two options. You either use command and control, which means you always need to have a leader in place to tell people what to do, or you can create structures and loosen like links between people that actually help them to make decisions that are in line with each other. And that second system is literally culture. So it's A sum of dynamics or a sum of rules, what we also in psychology call norms. So things that people on the team understand are important and need to be prioritized, that basically ensure that even if a leader is not in the room, if your people are entirely autonomous in how they create value for your customers, they make the right decisions, and they make the decisions in the interest of the company and in the interest of the strategy that you crafted. So it's this very impactful, very interesting and powerful instrument that if you actually learn to play really well and you figure out how to iterate on it with your team, really enables you to basically leave your team to it and be fully autonomous and scale while still being aligned on strategy, your future, and how you make decisions. Which is why I think culture is such an interesting topic, because it carries that power that if you actually solve the riddle, even though it's not an easy one to solve, you will really, really get a lot out of it. And there is an exponential function between the alignment of culture and the actual outcome that you see on kind of the financial side of things. So if culture is so interesting and it's so great, and we all need to be able to handle and manage it, how can we actually do it as entrepreneurs? Because again, when building a business, it's definitely maybe not the first thing you think about. There is customer value, there is products and services, there is infrastructure to be solved, and a lot of assets being developed. And I think whenever we think about people things in growing companies, it's often mostly recruiting that actually is on the top of mind, and not necessarily culture. However, culture is in the end the real deal. I think there was one quote from the former IBM CEO who basically said, when I started the job, I thought culture is part of the game. When I finished it by the end of my tenure with IBM, I think it was Lou Gardner, I understood that culture is the game, because it influences everything in your organization if you actually do it well. So how can you make it manageable? In our case, this is exactly the mission we are on. We enable companies and entrepreneurs to actually utilize an analytical approach, so to use data, but also frameworks to actually make it manageable and break it down and enable you to iterate on your culture. So I already referenced O'Reilly and his colleagues that have done a lot of research in it. So what we do is enabling leaders and companies to actually start with the first logical step when you start managing something, that is measuring it. So if you can't measure culture, it's really, really hard to manage it, because basically what all you could fall back to is anecdotal opinions and so on. And we all understand that great businesses are really driven forward based on thorough analysis, of course, a lot of inspiration and dedication, but in the end, it's all about that build, measure, learn loop that makes digital businesses really, really great and kind of fun to develop, because you actually start with a set of hypotheses, you build, you throw it to the market, you measure the reactions, and then you adapt. And it's entirely the same with culture. So why culture is so difficult often is because people assume it's not measurable, or it's really, really hard to measure. So what Charles O'Reilly basically did is to provide a framework that actually makes it very, very tangible and measurable. So I want to run you quickly through it so you get the idea and the hunch of it. Basically what he did is to say, when we talk to people in companies and we ask them about how do you work together as a team, we hear a lot of different aspects. But in the end, it seems that there are 6 dimensions at play that somehow influence all of the kind of content that we've been collecting. And I think the way they landed with these 6 dimensions is to look at many, many different engagement surveys and culture surveys that have been developed over the past 100 years. And they reduced complexity by running factor analysis over factor analysis, and basically ending up at this very synthesized core dimensions. So they described that when they measured culture in specific teams, they've seen a behavioral cluster that basically surrounds adaptability. So there is a lot of behaviors that are being described and decisions that are being made in the interest of being quick to take advantages of opportunities. So all innovative behaviors, all learning behaviors, all innovating behaviors live here. When you want to measure it with an assessment, we would typically use statements like, I'm quick to take advantage of opportunities. The second dimension is what we call principles, or being principled. This is typically a dimension that is related to wanting to do the right thing. So people that actually make decisions and show behaviors led by orientation towards high integrity, high ethical standards, and wanting to be honest and so on, are kind of summarized in this cluster of being principled. Then there is customer orientation, which is very straightforward, of course. So all behaviors and attitudes that you can see in your teams that are around listening to customers, bringing in the customer perspective, being focused on it, being market driven, also bringing in numbers from the market are oriented or clustered in this customer orientation dimension. Collaboration, pretty straightforward. Meticulousness or detail orientation is describes all behaviors that are related to being very diligent. So whenever you have teams and people that are really, really focusing and prioritizing the norm of being precise and diligent about processes and outcomes, would be described as very detail-oriented teams. So common belief or common phrase could be, let's make it perfect, or let's strive for the best result that you would see. And then last but not least, there's results orientation, which basically summarizes all these behaviors that are around achievement and wanting to achieve goals and outcomes. And typically what you see is a lot of behaviors that are oriented around deadlines. So anyone who you can observe in your team and in your company that is very focused on driving results and adhering to deadlines can probably be characterized as being in a results-oriented mindset. So these dimensions are obviously not absolute, and they're also not covering 100% of your variance. So if you observe people working with you and your team, you will always be able to kind of like map out whether you're being more adaptable right now, more results-oriented, but you won't be able to capture all of it. But that also doesn't matter as much, because in the end, those of you that are familiar with the analytical approach, it's the moment you kind of like go to simplicity or find a structure that is really, really tangible and like easy to understand and easy to grasp, you of course always lose a little bit of complexity or a little bit of variance. But so the idea to how you can use this framework is starting to actually measure culture and map it on these 6 dimensions. So the idea behind the model is that not every company culture is the same. So the moment you start measuring it, and I'm going to see show a couple of examples, you will see that there is differences and nuances in every team and in every company. And so of course the question still remains, how do we actually get to a great company culture, and how can we create it in such a way that enables us to be successful? So O'Reilly gives a really good answer to this, because he basically found in his research that those teams and divisions that have driven more financial outcomes haven't necessarily been specifically more adaptable, specifically more customer oriented, specifically more collaborative. So there seems to be not one right culture. Every company can and should have its unique cultural profile. But what's really, really important is that if you actually don't prioritize any of these dimensions, so if you don't decide that what matters to you in your context is adaptability, or what matters to you in your context most is collaboration, you basically end up producing a diffuse culture, an unclear culture. So a culture where people or employees have difficulties making decisions and prioritizing. So what he says is those cultures that produce the best outcomes seem to have a set of norms that are actually widely shared and strongly held. So it's not so much important about, it doesn't matter as much to actually maximize for all these dimensions. It's more important that you actually prioritize and say, in our context, for our business and our customers, it's really, really important to be meticulous, because we are in a very analytical business and details really matter and so on. Then it's really key that everyone who's on board of your company actually can relate to this and prioritizes this with you. What is really kind of like difficult and leads to diffuse culture and impacts outcomes is when you have detail orientation in some parts of your team and then high adaptability in other parts of your team, because basically they're pulling in a different direction. So before I go into more detail on how this works, I want to give you a couple of like more tangible examples of companies and how this can be applied in your case. So what we've done when we actually were building a product around measuring culture, we have found that we can actually see these differences between when we look at different companies in the field. So companies do prioritize. Those companies that have a strong cultural core, like Netflix, like Airbnb, companies that stand for a specific idea and a specific vision, actually do prioritize one of these dimensions more than others. So it's of course not black and white, and just because you prioritize being adaptable, being a very fast-moving company, doesn't mean that you don't need to be diligent or don't need to focus on your customers. But basically, it pushes as an entrepreneur and as a leader to kind of buy the disadvantages of a specific culture too. So when you actually say, we actually think that what matters for us the most is to innovate very quickly. This is why people buy us and so on. You need to be aware that if you actually prioritize this, what you will be having as a team, or what you end up building, is a team that actually also will experience a lack of consistency and be more unpredictable and feel more chaotic. And that's just part of the deal. That's part of what you're building. So whenever you make a decision in a specific direction and you prioritize one over the other dimension, you basically also create a very clear profile of what your weaknesses will be as a team. And so it's very good that you actually have that clarity, because then you can manage around them. What you cannot have is if you try to focus on everything, you basically end up having a very confusing cultural core, which then ultimately impact how your team performs. So how did we actually find out which companies have which culture? I'm going to walk you through examples. Is to use our technology that we have developed, which is based on NLP, so it's natural language processing, which basically works and operates on any text data. So what we've done, in order to understand whether these cultural differences really exist in reality, since of course we believe science and we really appreciate our roots being a scientifically based company as well, we always want to test things out in practice and see whether it really pans out. So what we've done is basically to use Glassdoor data, so descriptions and feedback of employees on different companies, and actually running it through our algorithm that basically measures the 6 dimensions of O'Reilly, if you remember: collaboration, principles, results orientation, adaptability, customer orientation, detail orientation, and see whether there's any differences in how people describe working at Netflix versus how it is working for Google and so on. And what we have found is indeed differences. So as you can see here, and this is an ebook that I will circulate just right after the webinar, where you can read a little bit more details about this. What we've basically found is that when we look at Netflix culture and look at how people describe working at Netflix, they really point out its results orientation, its customer orientation. These are the 2 very prioritized dimensions and things that you can read in the Glassdoor reviews. While, for instance, doing the right thing or being very diligent doesn't play such a big role. If you compare it to Amazon, detail orientation is slightly more important, but you can also see a little bit of a deviation towards on customer orientation, which is lower, and also on collaboration and adaptability being slightly higher. So Amazon is more a company that is being described as very fast-moving, very results-driven, and a little bit of customer orientation. But in comparison to Netflix, it's much lower. And in comparison to that, Google again shows a very different profile, being very collaborative. So there's a big difference between the collaboration score in Amazon and in Google. So people working at Google mostly describe how it is to work with other people and what they like and dislike about this, and that there is a lot of collaboration and also, of course, a lot of disadvantages that come through it as well. But this is how the company operates. So the reason I'm showing this is because there is basically not one way to do great culture. There is many ways, and it's up to you to decide what is the profile that you need in order to deliver value to your customers. And it's just a very exciting design task in your business. Maybe last words around what it is and what it is not, because I think a lot of times we hear slightly confusing kind of like descriptions around culture. So culture is this very wide term that lives in the fuzzy human department. And so we sometimes mix it up with skills or personality factors. The difference between norms and what we call culture and skills and personality is that skills are something that you actually can gain. It's typically something technical, not necessarily only technical in terms of technology, but something that you can learn very quickly, and that is very domain and area specific. So if you move into a different domain, you acquire a new set of skills. And examples are, of course, being able to work and operate specific tools and so on, but also having great sales blueprint and kind of like, approaches to sell and market things. While personality is much kind of deeper and also long-term aspects of who you are as a human being. So it's mainly traits, they're actually genetically impacted, but also kind of develop as you grow up. So examples of very famous examples of personality dimensions are introversion versus extroversion, but also intuition versus being observant. And you're probably familiar with tons of models, MBTI, and so on and so on. So the difference between what we are measuring in terms of these 6 dimensions and these kind of skills versus personality elements is that norms are really basically a set of beliefs. So it's a mindset. And with that, it can be influenced, it can be framed. So a person might be in a specific mindset when they work for a company that's very, very diligent, and they might be in an entirely different mindset influenced by their context and people they work with if they work in a very collaborative space. So somebody who just joined Google and wants to be more collaborative will become more and more collaborative over time just because the context is more collaborative. While someone who's very collaborative enjoys Amazon will have to adapt over time and reduce collaboration because Amazon focuses on efficiency and being results oriented. So there is an interplay between how you see the world and whom you're interacting with on a daily basis, which also offers this great opportunity for you as leaders and entrepreneurs to actually frame the way people see the world. So it's there's literally a very beautiful opportunity to actually help people to develop a shared sense of norms, a shared set of beliefs that actually drive your company forward, instead of focusing on something like personality or skills only. So how do you actually do that? Finally, now that we covered a lot of kind of like aspects of what culture is and what it's not, I want to use the rest of the time to actually make it very actionable for you. So there is not one great culture, but there's many ways to get there, and it always starts with measuring. So if you don't know where your team currently stands, and again, where you believe it stands and what your perspective is will not necessarily be the same as theirs. So actually, every time we onboard a customer and we actually measure culture with them, we see that they're actually having a lot of aha moments, and they recognize their teams in a lot of the aspects that they see in a data-driven analysis of their culture, but there's always also surprising moments. So basically, if you don't know what the collective mindset of your team currently is, going to be very hard for you to pull it to where it needs to be. So the first step is measure. The second step is understand where you want to go and craft a strategy around which of the aspects that we just went through are more important to you. So who do you want to be? Do you want to aspire to be a very collaborative company like a Google, like there's also earlier stage examples. Stripe is a very collaborative company. And you can actually really use the culture radar that I've just shown before, and I will distribute this presentation afterwards so you can take a look and kind of like really debate and deliberate with your management team and your co-founders. Where do you see yourself? What's important in your market and for your customers? Do they buy you because you're very, very customer oriented and you create the best experiences for them? Do they buy you because of the innovation? Do they buy you because you deliver really great quality and you're very reliable? Do they buy you because you're great in collaborating and actually they also learn about that from you and you're a leader in that space like Asana is? What do they really value about what you're offering, and what kind of culture do you need to have? Once you've basically identified where you stand and where you want to go, it's all about getting making steps to get there. And this is not a 0-1 scenario. So it's not something that you can achieve in one step. It really requires iteration. I think the best way to describe this process is literally you build great cultures just as you build great products and companies. You start with a set of assumptions, you measure against the market, you find ways to adjust to come closer towards your target, and you basically do that in repeated loops. So it's exactly the same in this case. What you can use when you actually do that is we're building a platform that actually does exactly that, but it's just one example. There's many different tools that you can use to actually measure culture. We provide one that sits on top of Slack, and we're also integrating with other tools. So we are doing a behavioral analysis, which basically means we look at engagement, productivity, and culture KPIs, measuring it just right off the public channels in your Slack and basically giving you that information. The way it works is we basically ask you to do exactly what I just walked you through. So to decide which direction you're headed towards, do you want to be more in the adaptable cluster, more in the customer-oriented cluster? Once you've done that, we connect to your Slack account and actually show you real time how far off you are currently and how you're developing towards it. And then we also give you recommendations that are based on this analytical analysis. Where do you currently stand and what's your goal? To help you as a team get there. The way these recommendations work is typically we not only suggest specific concepts, but we also validate them. So we never would suggest something that we didn't find working for other companies. So social validation for us is just as important as scientific validation. And we always also give you an indication of how much impact that will have. So some initiatives are really easy to do, but some initiatives take time. And so we give you that estimate. What kind of culture is right for you? We just walked through the cultural radar. And I just want to point out and give you another mental model or hack how you can actually answer this question relatively quickly. This has been developed by Charles already as well. And the easiest way or the most surprising element here is that it's not really only about who you are as a person. Oftentimes founders think that it really is about them as people. And of course, as a founder, you always are the first kind of carrier of the vision and also of the mission of the company and the strategist and the designer of what the venture is. However, it's not the only element that matters. So it's not irrelevant what is important to you as a person, but it's not the only thing that should be considered when you actually set your cultural target. So the most important question to ask is why a customer actually buys from you. What does the market associate with you? What do they already see in terms of value in you? What's the idea that they are after? And that's a really interesting question to ask in general, of course, about your products and your business. But specifically when you think about it in a cultural context, what do they mostly relate to? And what is their idea of who you are and what you bring to the table? Once you've gathered that, so once you get answers from your existing customers around what they value in you, you can break that down with the simple question of, what is needed for you to execute your strategy? So let's imagine an example. One of your customers tells you, I really interact with you because you have the most innovative offerings on the market when it comes to this and this technology. Like I always know that whatever you create will be pushing the envelope of what's possible. If that is so, what you will need is basically innovative behaviors. Innovation is at the core of what you're developing. Once you have seen what your current culture shows, so once you've seen where you stand with your adaptability ratings, you will be able to actually identify the gap. So let's say adaptability is something that really, really matters, but what you'll find is that your team is all about collaboration and don't really care as much about adaptability. That will be problematic as you scale because it's not really clear to them why they exist and why the team exists and what value is expected of them. So once you have identified the needed culture, so the actual adaptability norm being very, very important, you can actually communicate that with your team. And then through hiring and rituals and behavioral changes actually get you to the place where you need to be and change your organization that way. I want to show you a quick example of how we did this. In our case, we actually, of course, used our own dog food. So we are a company based in Berlin, but we also have a team that we're developing in the US right now. And so when we started this was about 1.5 years ago, we were a very tech-based team and a very sciencey team. So customer focus wasn't something that came very easily to us. How we have seen it was that we actually had slower progress than we actually wanted, and our customers weren't as happy always. And we also started to have conflicts in the team. So we started measuring it. And what we found when we measured it on our own end is that we actually cared about collaboration a lot, but not so much about customers. It was our lowest dimension. Then we have developed a set of initiatives and so-called culture hacks that we actually tried on ourselves. So we actually tried round robin customer care, where we actually let everyone participate in customer care on intercom, not only the sales and customer success people, but actually also our engineers and designers and product people, everyone else basically. So we did that hack. We also tried letting our engineers join customer calls. We invited customers to the office. We implemented the customer office hour, and we started hiring for customer focus. So we said, if a person doesn't actually display any customer focus in an interview process, and we have a way of measuring that in the candidates as well in our platform, we won't actually even take them to the next stage of the interview. And so, of course, this is really harsh at first, and it feels a bit funny when you actually look for engineers and you're trying to find them very thoroughly, and then you measure them and they don't have any customer focus, and you have to say no. But what it actually did to us over time, and this is like basically between 2017 and 2019 now, is that with every initiative we managed to increase our customer focus, and that resulted in much better products, much better UX that we're delivering to our customers right now, experiences that basically sped us up. So like we have much higher speed right now in delivery value to market. So to wrap things up and kind of like make sure that we covered everything that is important to remember around culture, and we call them kind of 5 truths about culture, I want to walk you through a quick summary. So when you think about culture, you really need to think about it in prioritization. Just as everywhere else in your business, you will end up needing to make decisions. The worst thing you can do is to say, we want to have a great culture, we want to be collaborative and adaptable and very innovative and very willing to learn, and we want to hit all our deadlines, and we want to be super diligent perfectionistic about it. You will confuse people, it will not really help them, they won't be able to make clear decisions, so you'll make it very, very difficult for them. Culture is a constant thing. So it's not enough to just set values and then hope they land and kind of wait for the result. You literally need to iterate on it. Same thing as with product. You have to have a roadmap. And so your roadmap in culture actually consists of culture hacks, which means initiatives that you can brainstorm with your team, or you can get inspired by from the culture hacks library that we provide, that you can basically as well kind of use to see what other companies are doing. So it requires a constant iteration of management. You can measure it through mindsets and behaviors. It's not an intangible thing. You can literally use frameworks that exist to actually make it tangible and measurable. And it is key to succeeding in the market we're currently in. So the market is very competitive. Candidates are really seeking for a very clear cultural profile. They really want to know what you're about. And when they enter your team, they also want to see the behaviors and the mindset and the beliefs coming to life that you basically sell them. So it's really important to actually really consider this as a very key part of your business and iterate on it. And also set aside the resources and the time you'll need. And last but not least, it is a trial and error game. So in order for you to come to get to great culture, you'll go through a lot of failures. Some of the culture hacks that work for other people will not work for you. Maybe a customer, round robin customer care is not possible for you. Maybe you need to have different ways how you actually can instill customer focus in your employees. So what we really, really urge you to do and encourage you to do is find your own ways, use your team to actually make sure you tap into their creativity, and really just make it very clear to them that this is a common shared challenge for you as a company to get to a specific cultural profile that you want to have. And it's a common shared task, and a very exciting task for most teams as well, to iterate your way there. And that's basically it. I think actually we are just in time for questions, comments, and feedback you might have. So I'm really, really curious to see whether we have anyone coming in. Where can we find the case studies online? Yes, I'll be passing around an email, a follow-up email, I think, that will include the links to the case studies. They're on our website under the menu item resources, but I'll be including the links. And we have another question, which is, what are the things to avoid when building culture? So I think it's really, really important to not do the following things. Don't just create values, put them up on the wall, or don't only focus on actually the external element of culture. The external element of culture is what you put on your website, what you put in your communication materials and your marketing materials. I'm not saying it's not important, it's really important, but it's just half of the deal. If you don't focus on the internal part of culture, so if you don't actually set time aside with your team to talk about if we have customer, or if we lack customer focus, we want to be more customer oriented, how can we really achieve that? Use design thinking, use other techniques that you know as a team to really pull them in and really make it come to life. So probably most of you are familiar with OKRs and other kind of frameworks. Use the same approach, have a roadmap, put yourselves goals, and revisit regularly what you want to focus and improve on in your culture. This is the way to actually really make culture come alive and achieve this effect that when new employees join and they kind of go for lunch for the first time without founders or with only employees, and they really want to get to the core of like how you really are and how you do things. You want people to say, you want people to actually give a clear picture around how you act as a team, and you want them to be true to what you're putting out on the website. The way to achieve it is basically to pull in the team to iterate. So don't do this top down, actually enable them to participate in it. I am looking at the additional questions. What's the impact of business KPIs of building a successful culture? That's really a really good question. So what we typically see is if you start investing in this process, what will improve for relatively quickly is retention and engagement. So people will be more motivated to actually engage with your purpose and your product development, your customer interaction. So you will see a spike in engagement. People will start caring more because they feel more heard. The other business KPI that it results in ultimately is growth. So any growth KPI, if you're doing this exercise with growth teams, sales teams, and marketing teams, what you will see is literally a spike in performance. But you will also see a change in retention, so how long people stay, sick days, etc. So these are the typical KPIs where we see effect. And it typically takes between 3 and 9 months, I would say, not a year. So it depends on how quickly you move. We typically recommend companies to iterate on these things in, let's say, a monthly to a bi-monthly ritual. If you're a bit bigger already, then quarterly is also fine. I think it's very similar to an OKR cadence. What do you mean when you say that culture and behavior can be measured? Very good question. Basically, remember I was walking you through the 6 dimensions. You can measure culture in 2 ways. You can ask people about their norms and beliefs, and you can map them against the 6 dimensions. So you can literally measure a mindset of a person based on an assessment. Or there is also approaches like our NLP technology that we developed that basically picks up signals from the way people communicate. So when I say behavior, I'm referring to communication. So when a person communicates, you can actually read from that whether they are more collaborative, more results-oriented, or more customer-oriented. So you can actually start working with these dimensions. How do you regularly measure culture of a team? You showed a line charts sloping upwards. Yes, that was actually our line chart from our team. So if you're interested in trying this on your own team, go ahead and head to Bunch.ai and actually sign up for a free trial. We have a limited trial currently running where you can actually just try it out on your own in your own team. So it currently runs on Slack. So if you use Slack, it will be very easy and free to try. And you'll be able to just see the same charts that I was just showing you from our team on your own team. So yes, the easy answer to this is go and try it out, and you can find it at Bunch.ai. Are there any specific strategies for managing culture in 100% remote teams? Super interesting question. I've just actually been in touch with the chief people officer at Envision. If one of you is familiar with the, or some of you are familiar with the company that provides design collaboration platform, they are fully remote. I think they're heading towards like 800 people right now, and they're operating in full remote. There is definitely strategies, and I urge you to actually look into content that these companies share. So Envision, for instance, has a really good blog where they actually share hacks around remote work and how they do it in a very short way. I think the biggest hack is to not assume this is something that will just like work out automatically. If you want to be remote, you actually need to pick a model. There's different models like fully remote. Then there is the hub and network model. So you actually have some hubs and there's network. It's very important to be explicit about expectations when you work remote. That's probably like the clearest hack. But I really, really encourage you to check out Envision's blog and see what they write about it, because they've been basically writing about their experiences with it. And I have a last question, I believe, which is, thanks for the great presentation. I still have a question. You mentioned mainly big corporations in the presentation. Do you think the same strategy would work with smaller companies, less than 20 people? Are there any other steps which can prove to be more useful? Very good question. So yes and no. I think my whole point about this presentation and the stance we take as a company as well is that there is not one great way to do this. So it's definitely very different what will work for you in comparison to a Netflix or Google. The reason I use these examples is because it's kind of easier to place yourself in comparison. So it's typically like a nice gimmick game to actually ask a founder, do you want to build more of a Facebook or more of a Netflix and so on. But when it comes to culture hacks, and again, check out our library on it. If you sign up for the product, you will be able to find a link, and I will also include it in the follow-up email. You will see that the hacks we collected are actually mostly from earlier stage companies. So some of them are a bit bigger already, but we definitely didn't focus on the big Tech 5. So we've looked into Buffer, Asana, Stripe, and people like this. So they're definitely a little bit bigger already, but we've also digged up a lot of strategies that they used to use when they were younger. So I think it depends on what you want to improve, whether you're like into customer focus, for instance. I think a lot of things that actually are applied at bigger companies might also work in smaller companies. But when it comes to collaboration, for instance, it definitely would be different. So in a bigger company, pair programming, for instance, the number one hack. Yes, and in smaller companies, it will be more of a, just a more natural, organic culture hack. I think we covered everything actually, which is great. Thank you so much for all the interesting questions. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really, really excited to see you, some of you on the platform. Again, you can log in or sign up for it at Bunch.ai, and I will be circulating the materials I've been referring to in the presentation, including the slide deck for information. Really happy to be in touch. Please reach out if you have any further questions. Really, really excited to hear from you. Have a good day. Bye.